Playdead's Inside begins with a somber and atmospheric opening screen. All we have is the game's title and a faint glimpse of a forest up ahead. But the key thing we should be focusing on here is the rocky pathway in the centre, and particularly the prominent light that's illuminating it. This works well mainly because of its important implications which we see at the end of the game, which is why we should also note that on this opening screen we're also surrounded by darkness, gloom and fog. We're given the chance to soak in this atmosphere for as long as we want until we press a button, thus being presented with our protagonist. He's nameless, much like every other entity in this game, but what makes him predominantly unique compared to most things we see in this game is both his size, looking like a small kid compared to all the taller adult-like figures we see, and also his distinct red jumper he's wearing, working nicely and reflecting the redness of the title text as well. If you've seen or experienced Playdead's previous game Limbo, you'll know what to expect from here, as in terms of how the gameplay is carried out, there's near to no difference. The biggest switch up we see is in relation to the visual design, like having everything be fully three-dimensional compared to Limbo's black and white 2D aesthetic, but we'll get into that more later on. I find that to process a lot of this game, it's nice to lay out the scenarios of what's going on so we can not only understand clearer what's a relatively unspoken game as is, but also further make links to the past, present and future events of this game. For a game titled something as ambiguous as Inside, it should have the player questioning what this actually means. Is the title referring to being physically inside something, or perhaps more to do with being inside a concept, a process, or simply an idea? Although we'll later try piece together what's the importance and meaning of this title, it shouldn't be a surprise to say the opening walk through the forest is a blatant contradiction. We're given the title Inside and are immediately presented with someone out in the wilderness, which I think works very effectively in getting the player intrigued immediately, asking themselves questions like the ones I just asked. It's not too long after this where we end up heading through some barriers covered with barbed wire, and then seeing a huge truck with tons of people standing in the back. Whatever we've just discovered, it seems shouldn't have been seen by us, as our character ends up reflecting by going into a crouched position to be more discreet, with this being the point where we technically could have entered inside this dystopian nightmare which is about to play out, pushing our way past the open, natural, and most importantly untouched environment of the outside, and heading through a man-made blockade, and then immediately being presented with another man-made invention of a truck. A reminder at this point is that to make this video work, and hopefully not just be a repetition of other people's thoughts and theories, all my opinions in this video are solely my own. The only clarifications I look to garner are ones that I'm completely unfamiliar with, and actually do have an objective answer. You'll see more often than not with this game though, that like any good piece of abstract art, which is the format I equate this game to more than anything else, most things are merely presented and left for you to mull over in your mind. A very intentional and key decision for a game like this. The whole point is that they're giving you pieces to a puzzle that you'll only be able to ultimately solve in your own mind. The satisfaction in this case is less to do with getting a set answer which is presented by the game itself, but instead a personal view of how you as an individual perceive things. That's why it's also important to say that whatever I mention in this video might only be correct to me, unless I give an opinion on something that turns out to be undeniably wrong, a prospect which I hope to mainly avoid. Just realise that no matter if you agree or disagree with what I say here, you should ultimately experience the game for yourself and come to your own conclusions. In my opinion, that's really how you'll get the most out of this game. Back to what I was saying though, I think this is the first time we see a message of environmentalism which we see get reinforced as the game goes on. We see this blatant contrast of the natural environment being disturbed, first by these blockades, which take away from the beautiful scenery surrounding us, and then even more by the truck, not only being this huge metallic vehicle in the middle of plants and trees, but also of course letting out these air polluting fumes, which is one of the reasons I assume most of the game is covered by smog and darkness. I think this game does fall under the bracket of conveying a dystopian future, reflecting things we have and use frequently in the present day and showing the repercussions of what will happen if we continue to use them, without any more environmentally safe workaround. This dystopian future aspect also applying to numerous other subjects it decides to tackle, which we actually end up getting a hint of with the people packed like sardines in the back of the truck. The purpose of that at the time of seeing it is strange, but we haven't got enough information yet to decipher what this actually means, so we keep heading forward. Up ahead, we find two guards, where we need to hide behind one of these broken pods to avoid them, another functioning one being right beside the guards. For the most part, I'm unsure what the purpose of these pods are. They crop up quite frequently and always seem to have a light on the inside. Regardless, our first taste of the guards is a great moment and works into a greater point which we'll get into later. What we should observe right now though is both their trepidation at the prospect of hearing a possible intruder, and also the fact that they're masked, being a very important detail to an overarching message of this game. Continuing our pursuit of the truck, we come across a completely blocked off road with more guards in the distance. The sound's important to pay attention to at this point. You notice that despite being in the middle of a road that's already cordoned off, you have to realise the point of what do we associate roads with? Cars, but where are they? Not only can't we see any except this truck filled with what we can assume are captives, but we also can't hear any either. This tells us that we either really are out in the middle of nowhere, or perhaps more interestingly, there aren't any other cars driving around anyways. In the present day, due to how common and almost essential the automobile has now become to most people, even when going to forests like this in real life, it's hard to get away from the ongoing noise pollution from these vehicles, presenting even more questions in relation to what's actually happened to this world. Shortly after this, we end up getting spotted, being pursued first by a dog, which we end up escaping, but then quickly being discovered by yet more guards, which also start pursuing us. The repercussions we suffer in certain moments if we don't handle things like hiding from the truck or running away from the pursuers shows how ruthless these guys are. Despite clearly being a kid, they don't tell us we're trespassing and escort us away, but instead gun us down or knock us out. Whatever destination we're attempting to get to can assumedly be thought of as one that needs to be locked away from the general public at all costs. But then you've got to realise that for the endurance of this game, this threat never prevails. Whenever these guards are around, you'll always end up suffering a fatal consequence when getting caught. And for the large distance we journey throughout this game, we start to realise that perhaps it's not a matter of where we are. This could potentially be what happens to anyone getting caught by these guys anywhere. This could be seen as being contradicted with certain things we see later in the game, such as a moment where we witness what appears to be a train station with people walking on the platforms. This implies there must be some form of functioning society, but one that possibly only lets in exclusive individuals. Those who are either part of whatever government is running this place, if there even is one, or perhaps a more classist message of those who can afford to live normally, and are deemed worthy of living what is considered a standard life in this world. If it wasn't obvious enough by this point, the visual design of this game is astonishing. It's easily one of the best looking games I've ever played. Much like Limbo, everything here works off minimalism. Our main character, for example, doesn't have any facial features, something which also works in a story sense with how there's definitely a sense of everyone in this game lacking any individuality. But unlike Limbo, which was solely conveyed in black and white, here they introduce colour incredibly effectively, as we can already see with our bright red jumper, which contrasts against pretty much all of the grey environments in this game. But it also works effectively in terms of that greyness itself, having these fantastic backgrounds layered with smog. There's so many details you can pick out as being visually fantastic. The dust particles we can see floating around when illuminated by light, the underwater effects which feature brilliant splashes, and also just an immense amount of detail in relation to the placement of objects, even as small as things like branches and tiny bits of debris. This also applying to all of the land environments too. This really is one of those games where every time I replay it, I still find myself stopping at particular points just to take in the atmosphere. And although I'm mainly going over the events of the story in this video, the visuals are arguably the main thing which convey this narrative. Without the strong vision of how this game should look, and once again the sheer detail of these areas, you simply wouldn't have a sufficient amount of things to go off to piece the narrative together. Yet again, dystopian's the main word that comes to mind. Having a game filled with primarily grey buildings and objects might sound like it become boring, but that's far from the case. The best thing I think this game does is present a scale to all of these environments. They quite literally perfectly execute everything from tight claustrophobic caverns to wide open factory spaces. It's just one of those games that seems to click with everything I like in terms of visual design. It's never over the top, which in turn makes everything feel even more intentional and thought out, because the detail is there when you look for it. I don't even need to handpick. I found that with most areas in this game, you could stop pretty much anywhere and have a striking visual, but those are definitely the two things I enjoy most about Inside. The open, barren landscapes, which always seem to have fantastic cinematic lighting, and the surprising amount of detail that's featured within them. Just take a look at this screenshot for example. In the foreground you of course have the main character, and the objects we'll need to use to progress. If you're focused solely on progressing, you might only be paying attention to this part of the screen, which with the great lighting effects and intricate design of the building ahead will keep you satisfied. But then, gazing to the background, we see several layers of detail here. First being the trees and electrical posts from the street below, but then even further back, desolate buildings that seem pretty much abandoned. Yet again, all being clouded in the fog that I mentioned earlier. Once again, there's a lot going on here, but it's still understated in its appearance, with this screenshot in particular using light and shadows effectively to focus most of your attention on the box up ahead, while still making the environment feel rich with the background environment. Back to where we were though, our run from the guards eventually ends when escaping into a body of water, bypassing their light by swimming under the surface, and emerging at yet another road. This one drilling in the point that I mentioned earlier about this place being completely void of any other people, with there not even being any roadblocks this time round. The sign up ahead implies this road would lead to a place of importance, but it still appears that nobody's here to use it, or even if there is anybody to use it. We pass through a cornfield, which might seem like merely a minor transitional moment between the forest and the upcoming factory sections, but as we'll discover, holds quite a bit more importance than it first lets on. The transition does work well though, eventually hearing the sounds of chirping fade in, where we're met outside with a group of tiny baby chicks, with the most important element we should remember here being the fact the chicks don't just passively acknowledge your presence, but instead actively follow you like you're their leader. Initially it might be assumed as they're chicks, they might be looking to you for guidance, in replace of their absent mothers. But when looking back to this moment with certain knowledge we acquire later on, I definitely stay firmly with the leader idea. What seems like an innocent, almost comical puzzle with these chicks actually ends up holding a much darker implication if you're paying attention. All you need to do is activate what appears to be this vacuum type machine, suck up the chicks and blow them out the other end, thus gaining access to a block of hay we can use to get up to the next area. Along the way, we first observe a chick that appears to be somewhat injured, noticeably lagging behind the pack that's more closely following your movements. This first insight reflecting the idea of a herd mentality in my eyes, not having any serious implications at this point purely because we can assume the chicks are working purely off instinct. But translating this concept to humans, we can start seeing more clearly the idea of the more typical and what would be called normal people, leaving behind those who could either be less fortunate or, much like the chick here, genuinely restricted in their capabilities. The most impactful moment though comes from when we fire the chicks at the hay, most of them landing on the ground safely, except for one which merely lies dead on the ground. The actions we took to get to this point were selfish. We wanted to get ahead, so used and essentially abused these tiny creatures so we could get what we want. These chicks follow us looking for guidance, and in return we only think about what's most important for our circumstances, actually killing one of them as a result. Yet again, there's clear comparisons they're wanting you to make to actual humans here, although it comes in the form of two contexts for me. The first of which is a more optimistic and definitely possible viewpoint of having these chicks reflecting a rebellion that is actively assisting us in our mission. This rebellion idea is something that becomes unignorable by the end of the game, and implies that although certain sacrifices will have to be made along the way, even those as fatal as death, pushing towards the ultimate goal of tearing down whatever totalitarian place we're in is too important to not take that risk. A chick died along the way, and that's not a good thing, but it's something that in the saddest way possible was necessary to our progress. The other way you could read this is slightly darker, and revolves around some of the hypocrisies of our actions in this game. Although we eventually see that our main goal was pushing back against these oppressors, we aren't too far off compared to what these guys are doing. The chicks in this case representing any kind of civilization from any country around the world, which we've observed as being less powerful and subservient to us, turning them into an asset. Not looking at them as living beings, but merely something that will help our own selfish motivations out. I think both of these messages are reinforced in the future anyways, so it's also possible for you to read this in both ways in my opinion. Heading forward, we come across one of the more interesting mysteries in this game, which has major implications towards why this world is the way it is. You might miss it initially when jumping down from the roof onto the piled up pig bodies below, but looking at their bodies, you can notice what appears to be some kind of parasites moving around. If they're actually parasites or worms, it doesn't particularly matter. They seem to be attaching themselves to the bodies of these pigs for what appears to be an unknown purpose. Just up ahead, we also see these things bursting out of the ground, showing that whatever these things are, they're a natural life form, one that's not man-made. What initially seems like merely an interesting and grotesque visual becomes more important when encountering a live pig, which gets up and tries to take us down at all costs. Aside from being one of the more action-focused moments in this game, seeing us jump over the pig until it smashes into a building, and subsequently a concrete wall, it also houses something else which you'll likely miss if you haven't observed the parasites earlier, as upon smashing into the wall, we need to remove the parasite from the back of the pig, which I think a lot of players mistake for us ripping off its tail, something that I've got a feeling would most likely be intentional. After doing this, all of the aggression from the pig is removed. It's completely disheveled and noticeably exhausted, not even being able to move on its own, with us dragging it across the floor. The images of human abuse being reflected through animals is still strong here, once again showing this herd, mostly dead on the outside, and the ones that are still alive appearing like skeletons, being totally malnourished and basically on the brink of death. But outside of this theme of a totalitarian government not caring for its people, the parasite introduces something more important in terms of the game's world, and this is laid out very clearly from the events which occur after the encounter with the pig. Attached to the ceiling is what initially appears to be some kind of lamp, but by using the pig to jump up to it, our head then becomes attached to it, and the lifeless corpses in the background now become reanimated. It's already clear in this moment what's likely been done in relation to this parasite, but it only gets further reinforced as the game goes on. Whatever organization's in control, it's likely they saw the effects of what this parasite did to these animals, having what appears to be mind-controlling abilities, and attempted to recreate these properties in terms of humans. It's not just important to realize this fact for the drones that we start controlling, the technology here being the physical manifestation of controlling humans against their will, but also for the people that were in the back of the truck from earlier. We see they weren't really captives. I don't imagine at this point they're even capable of distinguishing they've been captured, or at least least hopefully not, considering they've got no control of themselves. Instead, they appear to be more like cattle being rounded up to a slaughterhouse. The only important thing about them is the purpose they serve to those above them, which, if you want to apply that message to our current real world, is very blatantly chastising these kinds of governments and corporations that work their people to the bone, and essentially make their lives hell. The actual puzzle here is a fine introduction to the idea of this mind control mechanic, which only gets further elaborated on as we make our way into what appears to be a city of some kind. The callbacks we see throughout this game are great, of course never being in your face and largely speculative on the player's part, but still interesting to witness. Here, for example, when making our way inside, we notice the drones queuing up, with the truck being right beside them, with the only other time we've seen a truck in this game being at the beginning, putting more weight and meaning to this location overall by showing the great distance both us and the truck have travelled to reach this place, possibly being a hub for these drones. Some less important, more gameplay oriented moments occur in between, like dropping a safe through a floor and yet another mind control puzzle. But the more substantial stuff comes from when we start scaling the rooftops. I won't completely ignore the idea of the safe though, with this for me clearly being a representation of a lack of any functioning economy in society. The safe could have been filled with stacks of cash or gold, but it doesn't even matter. The world appears to be too far gone for any of this stuff to actually have a purpose. Heading down from the rooftops though, the cattle comparisons become unignorable, as all these drones are quite literally being herded into a currently unknown location, while being supervised by the guards we saw before. As there's of course no kinds of mind control devices like we saw previously, we can assume that much like the parasites, those were merely a minor experiment in terms of this grand mind control plan. Now that headgear and another sentient person's physical input isn't even required. There's clearly been some kind of technological innovation since that point, where, much like the parasites, these people are stuck in this permanently altered state, moving by themselves, but not of their own volition. Much like most other puzzles in this game, forethought and trial and error is the primary way of solving it, being a good introduction to the idea of these huge security systems which let out a blindingly white beam, where getting caught in the middle of it will lead to immediate termination. All that's required of you is to pull up the gate before you turn them on, and you're back to a smooth progression. Well, that's until this happens. One of the most standout and iconic moments from the entire game, where we have to blend in with the surrounding drones and follow their movements as precisely as possible. The concept is already great, but putting us right in the center of this process reveals even more details about what's going on here. As we crash onto the ground and take the place of another drone, a camera immediately starts following us and doesn't leave us alone for the endurance of this section. This perhaps implies that something like this has happened before, which I suppose also makes sense from the numerous guards that are inspecting the line. Someone aside from ourselves attempting to gain access to wherever these guys are being sent. The gameplay itself requires us to pay the most amount of attention to our movement in the entire game, having to quickly recognize the patterns which the line's moving at, first including how many steps they take forward, and as we progress, picking the right time to jump or turn around. We eventually get sniffed out by a dog though and have to jump through a pane of glass, amazingly not dying and not even getting injured in the process. It's after this point where we end up taking a huge descent into the factory, which results in a surprising amount of our experience here taking place in water, with most of these dilapidated places being completely flooded. One interesting thing I want to mention is a theory which correlates the experiences of this game to the removal of a cancerous tumour. The only reason I mention this is because it gives more narrative credence to why there's so much traversal through water in this game, looking away from the fact they may have just liked this approach in terms of the gameplay. This theory, being made by the user Formicide on Reddit, equates the boy to a benign tumour, describing his journey forward as the tumour integrating its way into a human's body as unnoticed as possible. This being where I paid attention to the water in this theory's case, clearly reflecting the idea of this cancer entering into the bloodstream. The drones are equated to different parts of normal bodily functions, being overtaken with our influence, where more often than not we use these guys to get us further to our goal, or just to wreak some havoc on the environment being a human body, remember. There's even more credence given to this theory with specific events we see in the game, and the theory's good enough to where all the elements can be backed up pretty reasonably. I thought it was just appropriate to give an example of someone else's theory that still holds up, despite being drastically different to my personal view of the game. And as I said, there's no issues in either of our viewings of the game. Whichever one gives the player the most satisfaction is the one that I think should be believed by them in my opinion. Getting out of the water for a period of time shows this fantastic contrast which I mentioned earlier on, where we see what appears to be a train station above, and then when heading forward, having these train carriages be contrasted with these wooden carriages carrying thousands of drones. This kind of imagery still fits in line with everything we've been talking about, but more introduces the idea of slavery and slave labor, although we don't actually get to see any of these drones put to work, outside of what we make them do when taking control of them. You can naturally assume these guys are being used for a purpose of some kind, to benefit those more privileged than them. Perhaps it's these drones which were made to build the railways or drive the trains, all against their will, with no kind of compensation for their efforts. Just a brilliant and thought-provoking contrast which I really enjoyed, with everything from what's seen in the game itself to the masterful panning down of the camera, almost to reflect that despite what's seen on the surface seeming perfectly normal, behind the scenes so many people are suffering just to give the few privileged people an easier time in their own lives. Our descent continues until we stumble across a submarine being used by two workers, which we in turn take for ourselves and do some underwater exploration. There's not much to really see in this section, outside of some brilliantly handled artistic moments, like when we crash our way into this vast, desolate space through some wood pillars. The enormous piping we see here, presumably showing us that despite everything looking so run down in these areas, everything here still has a purpose. It's in obvious disrepair, but is still serving a function on the surface. That being said though, you could also genuinely make the point that all this stuff has been abandoned, left underwater, where no one except those trusted enough with submarines can see the chaos beneath. This is because when heading forward, we actually end up discovering what appears to be a facility underwater. Defined structures, walkways, glass containers where experiments were likely kept. This place once had a purpose, and for whatever reason it's now inhabitable, and is residing in the depths of the factories we saw previously. One of the most bizarre and important things we witnessed during our time down here is this vast forest which we gain access to when trying to get our submarine through a blocked off path. Gameplay wise, it's in this part where we're introduced with this yellow box, which upon pulling the lever at the top, presumably uses some kind of gas or air function to move the box upward. Whatever purpose this would have actually had, I'm still unsure about, aside from traversal, like we use it for. But aside from that, the forest is one of the most striking things about this place, coming out of the wreckage of the previous parts to tall trees and greenery. There's two important things to note here, the first of which being the reappearances of those pods we saw in the forest at the start. It now appears that whatever they were being used for was specifically to do with the forest itself, as much like back then, we see these pods being hooked up to the trees with wires. I'm still debating what the actual function is here, but whatever it is, it leads to the second thing, which is that they were clearly trying to create an artificial forest down here. This is where upon reflection you can realise just how many of these pods were scattered around the forest, all of which also had these separate devices connected to the tree itself, which you can see mostly from the bright green light that shines off them. This isn't the dense forest like we saw at the beginning. All the trees we see here are gigantic, there's not much variation in terms of what we see, and they're also all spread out from each other, once again appearing more man-made than natural. The purpose of it though seems unclear to me. Due to the exact same devices being used, this could imply the trees down here are supplying some kind of beneficial resources to the trees on the surface, considering the air pollution is one of the more distinct and unavoidable things we witness above ground. It's not a far cry to say the natural ecosystem is completely deteriorated, relying on this artificial forest to produce natural resources like oxygen. This might sound slightly extreme, and it definitely is, but as it's unclear how well aspects like sea life are doing, with marine plants creating a huge amount of Earth's oxygen. In this dystopian world, perhaps the fears of oxygen becoming scarce are genuinely serious, so they've resorted to ulterior means. Continuing on, we stumble across an entity that appears to be human, but for some reason can breathe underwater, and although we've had faint glimpses of this thing throughout our time down here, this is our first actual encounter with it. Gameplay wise, the functionality simplistic, but fine, using the submarine's light to wade off what we discover is an aggressive entity, with how she tries to burst open the glass and kill us. The purpose of these is initially unclear, at most appearing like a failed experiment, judging from the test chambers we see when looking around this sunken facility. But as we'll see, I think in a story sense they serve as a vital transition in terms of the character's role in this story. We'll talk about that when it happens though. This is where we reach what appears to be a mine, which admittedly is where I think this aforementioned transition really starts to begin. This is one of the most gameplay focused moments across the entire game's runtime, setting the player up with 3 different floors they have to go to, and collecting drones along the way to assist us in opening up a door. A door which requires 20 people to all be standing on the pressure plate at the same time. We can't just walk up to them and have them follow us though, instead getting hold of another mind control helmet, which actually breaks off when we attempt to use it. Somehow though, it still functions, despite not being connected to any kind of power source, having these drones now become our followers. This is why I mentioned this being a transitional moment, as despite not having a clear answer in a literal sense, I think this serves as our protagonist's first steps into launching a rebellion against these oppressive forces. The drones we collect may initially seem like merely a more broadened and free-flowing version of the mind control puzzles, but just witness things like what these guys do when you're completely still. They all huddle around you. As you've likely gathered, this is a direct callback to the chicks at the start of the game, and the message is ultimately the same as back then, but just put in the form of these drones. You're using these to push back against the oppressors, but at the same time, you're still ultimately using the oppressed to do your own personal bidding. I admit, that could potentially be a more cynical view than is intended though. If we take the belief which I hold of the helmet simply being a physical metaphor of our transition to a leader, we can assume its function is primarily useless. These guys are helping us out because they see we're all fighting for the same goal. Regardless of that fact, even the minorest of details indicate towards this being our protagonist's switch to a leader role. The fact that when you initially gain this helmet, he has to hold it steady on his head, almost trepidatious at having these kinds of followers and newfound power. But then, after a short time, he becomes comfortable, no longer holding the helmet on his head in fear of it falling off, but embracing his position and not being frightened of it. Even right from the very start of the game, I think this switch could be foreshadowed, with a detail which I've seen nobody mention. Remember earlier when I said the minimalistic art style presented more in the way of intentionality? Our character doesn't have a face, and his clothes have no amount of considerable detail to them. Bar for one thing, his sleeve. One of his sleeves is noticeably rolled up for the entirety of the game, which I personally perceive to be a reference to a classic call to action, a fighter's mentality, even going all the way back to posters made in World War II, like the iconic "We Can Do It" poster. The rolling up of the sleeves can be seen due to its connotations of getting to work, oftentimes on a hard and maybe seemingly impossible task. And by collecting up all of these drones, one of which happens to be dead, in which we show as little emotional attachment in using his lifeless body as everything else in the game, we gain access to an area that we've been hearing throughout our time in the mines. This is simply referred to as the pulse, and what I gather from this thing is that aside from any assumptions I can make about this potentially being a large-scale power source for the overground, I can imagine it's just as likely this is an experiment gone wrong, being trapped on a cycle of letting out incredibly powerful shockwaves, which may have been one of the key reasons why the entire facility we saw beforehand was either destroyed or abandoned. Whatever its purpose is, it can't particularly be distinguished, so I remember this entire section mainly because of the sound and visuals. You can really feel the impact of every shockwave that occurs here, and having it paired up with a dynamic soundtrack that reacts to every blast, eventually culminating into a beautifully ethereal piece of ambient music. It's yet another incredibly memorable moment here. From the elevator crash we see after this, we're left with another period of time that's largely focused on navigation. We see the reintroduction of things like the black-haired girl, now definitely appearing more like an experiment, with how it's clearly shown there aren't one of these things, but multiple locked up inside testing areas. But as I say, this girl works as the primary gameplay function for the majority of this section, having to continually work your way round her through bodies of water, and goad her back and forth so you have enough time to progress. This leads to a grand culmination, however, when it seems you've just gotten rid of these things and begin to make your way out. A rickety platform makes you fall into the water, in turn being grabbed by one of the things, which ends up drowning you. Unlike other times though, this doesn't lead to a fail state, but a strangely intimate moment between you and the creature, where she holds us in her arms as we fall further and further down, until she eventually places a device into our body, which by the time we reach the bottom, we discover has actually revived us and given us the ability to breathe underwater. This is the defining transitionary moment I was referring to earlier on. By not trying to fight these things, but instead letting them overpower us, we're reborn as the leader of the drones. This becomes more apparent when actually encountering some drones up ahead, but even even from this point, we notice the fish surrounding us all start following us too. Perhaps not being transformed into a leader of just the drones, but also noticeably having an influence on other life forms too. A lot of people have tried to speculate about what exactly it is that gets inserted into us, although as per usual, I think it's less to do about what's physically inserted into our body and more what it represents. But if we had to take a guess, the bright yellow light that shines off the device looks identical to the ones that surround the mind control helmets, now having that physically inside us, which could have darker implications. Consider for a minute, this entire time, the boy has been fairly aimless for the most part, heading forward with no other ambition than pure adventure and discovery. This might not be the moment he's turned into a leader, but instead turned into a drone himself. Perhaps this is the process that's done to all of the drones we've seen up to this point, inserting this device into their body, which in turn makes them subservient. That means our motivations from this point on would not be our own, but instead whoever's controlling us, perhaps the black-haired girl for example. I don't personally believe that to be true, but just something else to think about. Making our way out of the water, we eventually come across a room which appears to be working with anti-gravity, in which we physically transition ourselves to the top part using the yellow crates, and in turn can start swimming around. As we can see, the place is swarming with bodies, all of which are hanging in the complete opposite direction to the ground, some of which show the reappearance of the parasites, still crawling inside their body, with what I assume are these test subjects, perhaps being ones which were experimented with before a man-made mind-controlling device was created. The most interesting part about this anti-gravity section isn't the mechanic itself, however. I personally can't extract a meaning from this technology apart from being a genuine experiment, or in a more metaphorical sense, perhaps showing a difference between those in the upper levels of society and those who are on the bottom. That's a bit of a stretch though. The most vital thing I think happens here is when we enter what appears to be an experimenting room with a lever, where we can rise and lower the water inside the room. The transition to this place is peculiar off the bat, not keeping us in the room itself like most other times, but instead zooming the camera out and cutting out all the noise, to instead view this from behind this glass pane and computer screens. We've already assumed this is genuinely a testing room, so the idea itself might have just been a nice shot to reflect how people would have observed these test subjects in previous experiments, if not for the fact we can distinctly see two people observing us from behind. This is one of the most twisted and key details to notice earlier on, as although you can definitely see they're observing you, unlike every other time when you come across an outside force, they don't do anything. They simply watch you work your way through the room and let you go on your way. I won't dive too deep into this facet right now, but just keep this in mind as we progress. As we make our way into the final section, this having one of my favourite visuals in the game, with how we're not only dashing forward to this large facility ahead of us, but also what we can presume are the scientists in the background. Whatever's going on in this place has these people shaken, and along with the help of our group of drones, these guys now noticeably following us without any kind of mind control device attached to us, we make our way inside. It might seem like I'm grazing over that fact in relation to the drones following us, but as you're aware, I've already established this was going to happen because of the symbolism that was presented earlier. The main thing to say about this is we firmly become the leader of what we'll see as a rebellion against these oppressors, using these battered and bruised drones who are covered in bandages and missing all kinds of body parts to gain access to what we'll see as this rebellion in a physical form. As we make our way in, several scientists run past us, some looking incredibly panicked with how they're crashing their way through chairs, simply because they can't take their eyes off what's in front of them. Same goes for when we see all of them observing the tank ahead of us. They acknowledge our presence, but quite literally don't care, being transfixed on what's inside this tank, even despite us not fitting in line with anyone else here. We eventually work our way round to reach the tank itself, where heading inside shows us being shot up from a huge fan on the ground, arriving on the other side with all of our clothes removed from us. This is what I believe shows our transition from an individual into part of a bigger uprising. The individual characteristics that make the boy who he is no longer matter. Becoming part of this rebellion makes people on the outside perceive us as one and the same, that being a dangerous threat that's attempting to tear down the system which keeps them satisfied, and keeps them having power over us. This is where we encounter this huge blob, with the colour of it and the numerous body parts we can see sticking out of it, making it clear this is a large mass of human body parts merged into one. This is what I perceive as the physical embodiment of the rebellion, something that up until our arrival has remained docile and stagnant, still being dangerous as we'll see, but being kept under control and closely observed by these higher powers. With our help though, we serve as the catalyst to get this movement going, removing the chains and wires it's been locked up in and releasing it from captivity. The rebellion begins here, bursting out of the tank and wreaking havoc on the surrounding area, taking a few of the workers down with us. We head back from where we came, still being given assistance from our drone friends, and start crashing through all kinds of offices and recreational spaces until we reach what we can assume is the boss's office. This sole figure is one that's painted out much like everyone else, but because of aspects like the room we find him in, his importance and role to this whole operation is implied to be far greater. He's the one who's likely calling the shots of what's going on in this facility. So unlike the other workers, which we primarily avoid apart from those who happen to get caught in the crossfire, we ram him out of the window that's behind him and crush him into a bloody pulp. What ensues is simply our escape, with the most notable moments coming from a few things which make a grand impact in relation to the ending. Along the way, we end up getting assistance from the actual workers, not drones. During our escape, this initially appears like they're so frightened of us that they're willing to help us out, much like the guy who opens the door for us, typing in the code but backing off whenever we approach him. But then we've got others, like the guy who throws us the yellow crate. He's in a position that we can't even reach, but still helps us out. This could make us realise that the evil actions this organisation have been taking are not the whole. These workers, much like the drones, despite having far more privileged positions than us, may still feel that sense of oppression, or maybe they quite literally just want to help out the less fortunate. Or at least, that's how it initially appears. Their actions are called into question almost immediately when the door we open with the yellow crate leads us directly to a room filled with observers, dangling a yellow crate above us that's just out of reach, almost like we're some kind of freak show at a circus. The fact that everybody's standing perfectly still, no sense of panic, even bringing kids to watch along and sit on the floor, shows there's no sense that we're actually dangerous. It seems like a major contradiction. Everyone beforehand was in pure panic mode, and we just wiped out what we presume is their boss. Our actions were assumedly unexpected, but here we are in a room where it seems like people have been waiting for our arrival, perhaps even way before we entered the facility. The yellow crate's a trap, of course, but we managed to find a way out of the tank of water we get placed in, eventually finding some wooden pallets which we burst our way through, taking things full circle by showing us tumbling through a forest in which we reach our final destination. The sun shines down on us as we finally reach somewhere not plagued with industrialization and authoritarian rulership. I think much like myself, the first thing a lot of players will be thinking at this point is the title of the game, and how we finally managed to break outside of the harsh environments we've been travelling across throughout our journey. But what might seem like an optimistic, if bittersweet ending where it seems like the rebellion is winding down, potentially dying due to its purpose being served and freedom being garnered, this is actually a game with one of the most depressing endings I've ever experienced. Perhaps due to how this optimistic feeling is utterly tainted under further analysis. To begin to understand this, we should head back to the anti-gravity testing area. Remember that room where it appeared like we were under observation? Well, that was absolutely true. It's just the fact that because of everything we experienced up to that point, we wouldn't have known it. It seemed like we were in control. We personally were sneaking our way through dangerous traps and avoiding guards that were literally out to kill us. But the biggest twist of this entire game is that it was all a setup. None of our actions were our own. Everything that we experienced was pre-planned beforehand by these higher powers. Having us be observed was one thing, but then taking a look back to our rampage through the offices, we get the smoking gun to how everything was set up beforehand. During one of the moments where we crash through the floor, we emerge inside a glass container featuring a diorama. And as you can see, it's the exact same setup as the closing shot of the game, even having everything down to a spotlight being shot onto the coast to reflect the sunlight which shines on us at the end. This makes it clear why we've actually been able to get up to this point. With the kinds of equipment they've been using and the huge technological advancements that we witness, it becomes obvious that we didn't break our way into these areas. We were let into them. They knew everything that was going to play out, and in a gameplay sense, I imagine every one of our failures where we end up dying would have also been planned. If we die, it shows that we weren't worthy of starting this controlled rebellion, assumedly with another supposed renegade being put in place to carry out at this point what appears to be one grand experiment for these higher powers. The purpose of it could be numerous things. Perhaps the game's telling us the rebellion is very real, but simply one that's so controlled to the point where they know exactly what's going to happen regardless of there being an uprising. A similar but slightly different theory might point towards this being one big safety precaution, laying out the idea of this rebellion uprising taking place and playing it out realistically to observe and note down what to do if one were to actually take place. This makes things like the room with the dangling yellow crate incredibly clear. Of course these people weren't frightened, they knew they weren't in danger, and I suppose you could also look at it from the fact that everything we see is actually genuine. It's not a grand experiment experiment from these higher powers, which granted does mean a fair more amount of things we see have to be explained away with symbolism, but we do actually make what we presume is an escape, where only under further analysis do we realise even though we've escaped everything we've been experiencing beforehand, we're still trapped within the confines of this planet. In reality, our escape is only temporary. The small triumphs we might have made along the way, like killing the boss and tearing down their infrastructure, don't really matter. They can be replaced and things will go back to how they were before. Everything in my eyes is summed up when it comes to the secret ending of this game, one that occurs after collecting all the collectibles throughout the game and heading back to the cornfield at the start, where we can stumble upon what appears to be a secret bunker underground. The ending itself involves us discovering a room filled with computers and yellow wires, which we've previously seen being connected to all the collectibles throughout the game. To our right is a cable plugged into a wall, where upon unplugging it, the boy becomes slumped over, just like all of the other drones we've witnessed throughout the game. This has one of three possible meanings for me, two of which being more in relation to the events of the game, and the other taking on a meta-narrative meaning. The first one being that much like we just witnessed, with everything already presumably being pre-planned by these higher powers, there's a large possibility they're quite literally in control of us throughout the entire game. A new breed of the drones, if you will. One that doesn't appear lifeless and robotic, but one that's almost indistinguishable from all of the workers we see throughout the game, being able to both blend in with regular people while at the same time still doing the bidding of those that are controlling them. Then the second option, which is less important to what we actually see in game, or at least that's what I perceive, in that this reflects the player themselves as these higher powers. It's no mistake, the computer screens and chairs in the back have a striking resemblance to a computer setup you may well be using to play the game, and by unplugging this device, it's putting our own actions into question in terms of the controlling we've been doing throughout the entire game. Much like we've taken control of others using the mind control devices, we've also been doing that with the boy the entire time, this still being a device, but one we're using within the real world. That's more of a commentary on the idea of control in general, but the final theory would be in relation to the blob once again. If we presume this mind control device with all of the yellow wires coming out of it is actually connected to all of the mind control devices, this would mean no more drones of course, but let's not forget, these exact same coloured devices were placed onto the blob as well. This is where in a literal sense, this blob may have been the one that was actually in control of the boy the entire time, guiding us forward to come and release it from captivity. Possibly doing this of its own volition, but also just as likely being another experiment from these scientists, due to there being no clear way for the blob to attach these mind control devices to itself to begin with. On a symbolic level, however, this would simply lead us back to the idea of rebellion once again, being guided and drawn to this explosive uprising from what we observe throughout the game. Inside is one of the most fantastically crafted games I've ever played. The visuals are so unique and striking. The sound design always has a nice contrast between being desolate and ambient, and then having moments which are ground-shakingly explosive. And of course, the narrative I find to be one of the most understated but thought-provoking delves into ideas like totalitarianism, classism, slavery, technology, and how all of these kinds of things lead to there being a distinct hierarchy in terms of society. To wrap up my thoughts on this story, I think aside from all of the details like who's controlling the boy, and if this entire journey was a setup from the higher powers, the main thing this game does is reflect the complete degradation of a society not too dissimilar to ours. I'd like to quote PC gamers James Davenport in this regard, as in their discussion on this game, he tries to sum up quite nicely what he believes the game is about, with a lot of his theories fitting in line with how I personally view the game as well. To me, it was pointing out the failures of revolution, how a class or race or whatever it may be comes out on the other side when facing a huge social or political power. Short answer, not without bumps, bruises, and plenty of generational trauma. Inside feels designed as an impressionist game, and that's what I came away with. The more I try to nail Inside down, the less I like it. The only parts I disagree with in that case is the final part, of course. I believe he's right in saying it reflects the failures of revolution, but it's more to do with the failure to break out of these social and political powers. They're unable to appropriately figure out a plan to overthrow these higher powers, because all their plans are already prevented before they've even begun. Unlike Davenport, I find the more you delve into this game, the more things you'll find to ponder over. If you're looking for a narrative that has set answers, and even basic clarification on elements like the mind control devices, or the pods we see connected to the trees, you simply aren't gonna get it, because that's not what this story's about. That doesn't mean it's window dressing, of course, far from it. It's merely things which we can assume have been carefully thought about and executed in a way that will keep players thinking about what this game's about, and what certain elements of the world are actually trying to reflect. I bring the man up so often nowadays, but my favourite film director, David Lynch, is exactly the same in this regard. People have oftentimes criticised his work for being confusing for the sake of it, but that view appears so far from the truth to me. On a base viewing of any of his works, you will find ideas there which he's working off. It's just that unlike a lot of filmmakers, he works purely off those ideas, which come directly from his head, which leads to a lot of abstraction. It's the same with Inside. On merely a first playthrough, the imagery's very clearly related related to the ideas and themes that I've already mentioned. It's just more reliant on the player themselves to piece these things together in their own head, and further analyze the events and details throughout the game to get a clearer understanding of this. It's a risky game to play, admittedly. There is a reason why many people don't like this kind of approach. All the heavy lifting is on the viewer. The narrative is unconventional in how it's conveyed, and some people just aren't gonna like that. They're gonna feel that if they haven't reached a satisfying conclusion, and haven't been given a set meaning from the work itself, they've wasted their time. But I advocate for the opposite. The less you understand this piece of work, the more heavily you should dive into your thoughts with it. To quote Lynch himself during an interview with The Guardian, he says, "I don't ever explain it, because it's not a word thing. I would reduce it, make it smaller. When you finish anything, people want you to then talk about it. And I think it's almost like a crime. A film or a painting, each thing is its own sort of language, and it's not right to say the same thing in words." What he's saying is that the ideas presented in the piece of work itself should stay as they are, without any justification. Especially in abstract pieces of work, having the creator give their own personal view on the story they've created makes other interpretations completely void. If an artist says what the work is about, and you come up with something different at that point, you are then lying to yourself, because it's just not what's intended. From what I've seen though, the creators of Inside have hardly given any clarification to most of what we see, meaning that most theories made about the game could possibly be valid to a certain degree, which in terms of the work itself keeps people talking about it for years to come, as there'll always be that sense of intrigue and mystery to it which people will surely want to discover, peeling back every layer of this game's rich narrative to where they've got a conclusion that personally satisfies them. Overall, there's no doubt in my mind this game's a masterpiece, but one that some people just aren't gonna like. Some will definitely find it boring, as the gameplay is intentionally simple. Some won't like the narrative because of how many blanks you personally have to fill in. But for those looking for a game that has a story that is poignant to our real-life modern-day culture and society, some incredible visuals, and admittedly some very interesting ideas in terms of the gameplay, such as the anti-gravity puzzles and mind control devices. For me personally, everything that's presented here is immaculate, and much like Playdead's previous game Limbo, is an experience that I've come back to time and time again, and one that I'm sure I'll keep returning to as the years go on.